Do you think there was some kind of deal worked out in advance of the resignation?
I do indeed. I'm certain Mr. Ford wouldn't be in the White House. And I don't care if Jerry ever speaks to me again. But I'm sure that there was a deal worked out with Mr. Nixon before he left.
What would you recommend in this case? Did you want Mr. Nixon to be convicted or tried?
I hadn't come to a conclusion on that. I was waiting for public opinion to come around to a polarization. I don't know what the American people would like in a situation like this, but it's not fair for him to be given amnesty and the other people serve jail terms.
Do you expect amnesty to be granted to the other men?
Well, the way it looks now, no, unless American public opinion comes around to that.
What about the sense of timing? Granting pardon before a man even goes to trial?
Well, that just shows his guilt.
Okay, well, my name is Mae Brussel, and I live in Carmel, California. And I recently published an article in The Realist, I'll hold a copy for you, called Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? And the article is in a magazine that's known for its satire and its comedy. Paul Krasner has published satire for the last 12 years, going on 13 years. And it was published in The Realist as a very serious article on a condition which is existing in America today. And the crux of that condition is epitomized, in my mind and in Paul Krasner's mind, in the story of Martha Mitchell's handling after the Watergate arrest in Washington, D.C. And I have a sentence in The Realist that said, the manner in which Martha was handled simply indicates how the fascist police agents are forced to treat any witness to their espionage acts. Parts of the invisible government that exist in America today were visible to Martha Mitchell, and she panicked. Martha has to be a political prisoner because she was a witness to some kind of dirty work. This article was published, I finished writing it July the 13th. And the dirty work I was speaking about was the break-in at the Watergate Hotel where Martha and John Mitchell live, and an agent of James McCord, who was arrested at the Watergate Hotel, was hired by John Mitchell's committee to re-elect Richard Nixon as to be chief of security for that committee. And he was arrested at the Watergate Hotel breaking into the Democratic headquarters. That evening, the weekend of the robbery, they called it a robbery, it was a clandestine, covert activity. That weekend, the Mitchells were in California. They were not at their hotel in Washington. They were in California. That does not mean that Mr. Mitchell wouldn't know that they were going to enter the Watergate. He may or may not have known. But they were in California. But the phones began ringing, or people came in to their place, and Martha Mitchell realized that she had seen dirty things. And she panicked, and she called Helen Thomas, the UPI, and said, I saw dirty tricks. I know of dirty tricks. Politics is a cop and robbers game. I want my husband to resign and get out of politics. Well, she was talking on the telephone when a gentleman from the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon, an agent, went into her room and yanked the phone off the wall. And they ripped that phone off the wall. They ripped the phone off of her daughter's wall. And no more was heard about Martha Mitchell until she reached the UPI again and said that 5 men had held her down and beaten her up, and that she had stitches, and that she was injected with a fluid and against her wishes. And Martha Mitchell reappeared in Rye, New York. The time sequence is uncertain, whether she was awake when she was transported or asleep. She surfaced 3 months later. This was June when she said that. She surfaced 3 months later in September, because the man who did the kicking to her and knocked her through a plate glass window, Steve King, was promoted to chief of security for the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon after he had held her down while a doctor injected a fluid into her behind. And she had 6 stitches in one finger, 5 stitches in the other. Her hands may be permanently stiff. She can't wear her wedding ring, and she was thrown through glass and stomped on. She couldn't see her husband for 24 hours. She didn't know where he was. And John Mitchell was out in California with Martha Mitchell while this was taking place. She has involved her daughter, which is something a person or a family seldom does, and said, ask Marty if Steve King isn't the man who did the ripping off the telephone cord. So she has involved her own daughter into this process because she knows that she's right. Now, John Mitchell was somewhere at the hotel in California at the same time she was, and staying at the hotel With her was Patrick Gray III, the acting head of the FBI. And Patrick Gray III told the news media that he didn't know that John Mitchell was at the hotel at the same time he was, that, well, it was a large hotel, they had different rooms. But it would be interesting to know if John Mitchell didn't see his wife for at least a minimum of 24 hours while she was being brutalized. Where was John Mitchell, what room, if he wasn't with Patrick Gray? Because the commotion of the men being arrested at the Watergate was going on. I got interested in the Watergate affair that I wrote about. The article in The Realist is broken into 3 parts, and each part is equally important to this entire nation at this time. The first part is the Watergate affair regarding Martha Mitchell and the fascist government, because we have 2 governments, one visible and one invisible, and the invisible government is surfacing all the time if people would be aware of it. The second, it surfaced in the Watergate affair. It's the best view of the espionage, clandestine government that the United States has been able to view publicly. This is the first chance we've had. In a fascist state, in a total fascist state, you wouldn't get this glimpse. They'd all be carted away. But because there's a semblance of a democracy until next November, we have our last chance to view these operations even in a superficial, small level. The first part of my article is on the Watergate affair. The second part is on the American assassin. And that's the creation of the motive for the news media of the American assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, James Earl Ray, Sirhan Sirhan, Arthur Bramer. These men did not kill anybody. They are alleged assassins. They are patsies. And the news media has focused upon the fact that they were loners, each influencing the other, and that is far from the truth. Each one of them was created by a set of circumstances which is purely fiction. They were hired. They're not innocent. They were hired to be at a place at a particular time and to leave that weapon or to use a weapon. But they did not kill the people that they were alleged to have killed. So you get a tremendous problem of manipulation of the mind for the last 10 years, defined as propaganda. And you get a chance to view it, how it works. It's currently, many people are not aware of the details of the John Kennedy assassination or the Robert Kennedy assassination, but I specifically want to dwell on the Arthur Bremer Watergate because those took place in May of 1972 and the elections in November 72. And if you can understand the Arthur Bremer attempt to shoot Wallace and the Watergate affair, then you can go back maybe to the other assassinations and see what happened. Because Patrick Gray III, the same man that was at the hotel where John Mitchell was at the time of the Watergate arrest, is the acting head of the FBI. And he was appointed just a day before Wallace was shot. And he has not been approved for being part of the FBI. He's a Nixon crony. He left the Navy, Navy intelligence, Navy Annapolis to manage or work for Richard Nixon's campaign in 1960. And he went from there to working for Richard Nixon in various functions, and no one knows his name. He'd never been in the FBI building. He didn't know how many departments they had. And the minute that J. Edgar Hoover was dead, Patrick Gray became the head of the FBI. And he closed the investigation of the Wallace shooting. Well, if he managed Nixon's campaign in 60, he certainly wants him to win again in 72. And Wallace's campaigning is a big thorn in the side of the Southern strategy that was carefully planned. And Richard Nixon can't swing an election unless he's sure that the anti-busing votes in Maryland, in the South, in Michigan, don't go to him. When George Wallace doesn't run, the votes go to Richard Nixon. It's just that simple. And the truth of these conspiracies is concealed by the people in power who work with Richard Nixon. I started my assassination work. I'll go back one more point. This very informal 30 minutes I'm spending with you on 9 years research, which is now starting in publications to be expressed in the writing form. I've done the research. The third part of the Watergate article is, the first part is on the Watergate arrest, the second on the American assassin, and the third part is called How Richard Nixon Really Came to Power. Because there's a connection between the work of Richard Nixon when he was in the Navy and working in Long Island with aerospace, which was just beginning to grow, not wind down. Our munitions factories and our warfare state was just really becoming realized as a business. It's described as American imperialism. We use our taxes and sell the weapons to us, and then we give them away to other countries. Our business keeps going by making the weapons here, and then we're giving them to other countries. It's our own unique form of imperialism that we're pushing on our own people. We're selling them that they need these weapons. And if we don't have more than extra, we just dump them over in Asia, anywhere, or stockpile them. But we keep making our money, our labor, tax money, produce these weapons. And this is American imperialism at work. Nixon was in Long Island, and he was supposedly winding down aerospace contracts, which were just beginning. And he was called by the Bank of America, the vice president of the Bank of America, as the selected candidate to run against Voorhees, Congressman Voorhees. Voorhees has a new book out about Richard Nixon and his contest against him for the election. It took him 20 years to write it. But Voorhees ran against Nixon, and Nixon was the first candidate on the Red Scare. And the link of Nixon to the aerospace industry and the importation of Nazi criminals from Nazi Germany and the placement of Nazis in the Southwest and the aerospace industries is a full cycle of war contracts, racism, against the minorities, enslaving people to keep them to run the machines and factories of an industrialized nation. You need slave labor and you need oil. And the weapons and the aerospace could control all of these if you pull your head together and your resources together. And Richard Nixon is linked to the aerospace industries, and the aerospace are linked to the political assassinations, and there's this full cycle going on, which is very hard for people to comprehend, but which has been broken down by the researchers in political assassinations. And I began my work on political assassinations, which ended with Richard Nixon and Patrick Gray, the full cycle, by studying the Warren Report when it came out. And a lot of people are confused about it. They don't own a copy, they never see it. It's simply a book that's 800 pages long that tells you, according to the Warren Commission and their authors, what happened in Dallas, Texas, when John Kennedy was killed and when Lee Harvey Oswald was killed. And they based their information upon a set of books which were bound, 26 volumes. And I brought just two in. These are the hearings before the commission on the assassination of President Kennedy. 15 volumes, such as this, are witness testimony about the assassination. And the last 15 volumes, volumes 16 to 26, are exhibits and documents and papers that happened before the actual murder took place. Notes from Lee Harvey Oswald's notebook, memos from Marina Oswald's phone book, tax papers, State Department papers, Oswald's papers in the Marines, job employment, college application, ballistics information. These 10 volumes were hard facts, and the first 15 volumes were witness testimony. And nothing that the volumes, the witnesses said in the first 15 volumes correlated to what the facts were before the crime was committed. So I spent 8 years researching where the differences were, because then it went into who appointed the commission, what members of the Warren Commission were on, and what were their relationships to oil interests and aerospace and defense contractors or espionage agencies, because Allen Dulles on the Warren Commission was the man who worked with Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence, and who placed agents all over the United States, all over the world. And Reinhard Gehlen, instead of being a war criminal, was given $200 million by America, and plus he placed espionage agents everywhere. And in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, they worked with the Oswalds. And that's in my article on the American Assassin, a brief description of the network. Well, I cross-filed this, and then you go into who wrote the Warren Report. I began to research that. A Mr. Winiger from the Pentagon wrote the Warren Report. When a book came out, Who's Who in the CIA, Mr. Winiger turned out to be from the CIA. The whole breakdown of the espionage system was a thing I occupied myself with 8 years. Who selected the staff for the Warren Report? The lawyers turned out to be CIA lawyers. The writers from the Pentagon, everybody, Coakley and Goldberg from the Air Force. Then you realize that you had a whole tight control of the book, the questions, and the selected witnesses. And the witnesses were called, never met Oswald. They were giving testimony, and pure fabrications were being called. And I spent years on this. And I followed the connection of the killing of John Kennedy because I cross-filed these 26 volumes so carefully in 100 other books that were coming out on espionage systems relating to this. Then there's the assassination of Robert Kennedy, which had a connection. The same pattern of cover-up, the same cover story, the same operatives at work, and the killing of Martin Luther King, and the way James Ray didn't have a trial, and who stepped in to see didn't have a trial, and the death of the judge. Judge battled there. There's a death of a judge at the time of the Soledad trial in California, and the death of a judge at the Alleging trial, and you began to cross-file which judges are dropping at certain times, and you get a relationship here of behavior. Well, at the time of the Watergate Hotel, the men that were arrested, there are 5 of them, were all agents of the Central Intelligence Agency, and they also were active in the Bay of Pigs. And that's very important, the Bay of Pigs operation, because one of the men arrested was Frank Sturgis, who belonged to the No Name Key Group. If you've ever heard Jim Garrison talk about the No Name Key Group with David Ferry and Guy Bannister and Lee Harvey Oswald. And it was that same office on Canal Street where James Ray got his money. So I realized when the arrests were made at the Watergate Hotel that these were very important men working, all employed by the CIA, all working at the time of the Bay of Pigs. And when John Kennedy wanted to smash the Bay of Pigs planners to shreds and scare them to the wind, he removed John Dulles from the CIA. But 11 years later, the same team was tampering with the electoral process. And the important thing was that the same operating man, the money man at the time of the Bay of Pigs, was working for the 1972 elections as a money man. And it's very important to go into the Watergate story. A year ago, an agent provocateur in Los Angeles by the name of Louis Tackwood had a press conference. And it was carried in the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the LA Times. And Louis Tackwood made the charge that he was leaving the LA Police Department after 9 years. He had planned conspiracies, he worked for the criminal conspiracy section, and he was leaving because Squad 19 was taking shape at that time in October 71 to hire radicals and get enough agents inside the Republican Convention and outside the Republican Convention to cause a lot of violence. There would be bombings, killings, maybe public officials, congressmen. Enough violence would be created at that time that President Nixon would create martial law. And after the martial law was created, with his Spiro Agnew as vice president, the president would be then killed too. And the names that he gave for his contact at that time, one of them was Mr. White, who was a cutoff man at the White House. And in a book coming out, The Glass House Tapes, which is at Avon Publishers, being published now, about the Los Angeles Police Department, Tackwood said there was $10 million set aside for the operation to overthrow this country, $10 million, and that the highest man up there, his name was Mr. Martin. He was the top boss. He said he was in Dallas on up. This whole team was the group that he was to reach. He has the tapes of the code of operation, and he mentioned the name White. Well, the time the men were arrested at the Watergate Hotel, James McCord signed in at the police department as Mr. Martin from New York. That was his alias. And the two of the men arrested had in their pocket the name of Howard Hunt, and one of them had the name White, Howard White and W.H. And the money that we've been trying to get a hold of to get our eyes on, that $10 million that Richard Nixon collected before the 7th of April of this year, that secret funding, was set aside without any revealing of names. The purpose was to protect people who donate before April the 7th. Well, Tackwood said a year ago that there was $10 million set aside for a fund. Arthur Bramer had an article that was in Life magazine or Newsweek about his diary. It was one of those two that said, Dickie and I would like to get a hold of tens of millions of dollars. The diaries that these alleged assassins leave are carefully staged and filled with codes and planting. Well, the subject comes up now, is the investigation of the Watergate Hotel going to be able to get into the $10 million funding? Was Mr. Martin, he is James McCord. And the time I'm making this particular videotape, they have not come up with a motive. This is September of 1972. Nobody has come up with a motive for the reason the men are assembled at the Watergate Hotel. And the evidence is overwhelming that the 4 men hired that were at the Watergate Hotel and arrested with James McCord were hiring provocateurs for the Republican Convention. to down in Miami that they were using CIA money, $100 bills, consecutive $100 bills, that James McCord was hired for chief of security of the entire Republican convention in Miami before he was arrested. That was his job, to secure Richard Nixon's life and the entire convention. And there he was arrested with 4 men who were hiring and making hotel arrangements for provocateurs, which are strange bedfellows for James McCord to be in. In my article in The Realist, and I will quote this, I quoted the Martha Mitchell thing, it said, "The CIA is not new at altering the choice of candidates. That's based upon my research on all the other candidates, and here are CIA operatives at the Watergate Hotel. They take innocent people, such as the electors, and they make them believe you have a choice of candidates in your next election. And even through the primaries, they are controlled. The same CIA that killed President Kennedy because he won the majority of votes, which eliminated the opposition to Richard Nixon, which was their selected agent to be the president, has altered every election since Kennedy's death. Murders, accidents, attempted murders through the use of hired killers, accidents meaning the accident at Chappaquiddick, which was arranged to eliminate Ted Kennedy as a candidate. The attempted murder is the Wallace shooting, which did not succeed but tried, but eliminated him as a candidate. Through the use of hired killers and planted patsies and news coverage, the CIA has been able to conceal their crime, which has been effective so far. And 2 governments have existed side by side, one visible and one invisible for many years. And as the power structure gets more arrogant and sure of itself, the invisible will be clear. But if the truth is told of the Wallace shooting and the Watergate alone is exposed, you will see the invisible government agents going about their daily business. Now, I also put in this article that one of the problems was to look into the Houston oil money that was coming into the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon, because people from the CIA associated with Houston and oil companies at the time of John Kennedy's murder. There's close links with John Connally. He's tied to the oil interest in the CIA Foundation in Houston, and is politically lined up for important Washington positions. Well, this week, the federal government closed their Watergate investigation. And they said that they have done a massive linear investigation. This is from the Washington Post. It was a massive linear investigation, and they never attempted to determine the source of the campaign funds or investigate the transactions if they were legal. This cannot be allowed in this country. The FBI is going to close its case on the Watergate by just prosecuting the 5 men that were arrested, or the 2 CIA men, Howard Hunt and Mr. Liddy, who were at the hotel at the time they were arrested. We cannot close in this country the investigation of the Watergate. Also in the article I mentioned that this is too big for anybody but Congress to investigate. By going into the secret funding of the $10 million, the funding of the Watergate Hotel, how it went from Houston to Mexico, back to Washington, to Mr. Stan Safe, and down to Miami, where it paid the provocateurs that were paying for the Watergate. We have to trace the $10 million fund, that $89,000 fund from Houston, and open up the Arthur Bremer case, because there was a conspiracy. And if we follow those 3 things, you may save the visible government that's just hanging on by a thread, because the invisible government is taking over the whole Justice Department with Mr. Kleinitz and Patrick Gray. There is no possible way of getting an investigation of what those men were doing at the Watergate. And if you investigate what they were doing at the Watergate, you may be able to save the life of Richard Nixon and this democracy, as feeble as it is, before you go into the next stage. There are degrees of control and oppression that people don't understand. And fascism is the total end of the freedom you have of press and speech, or voting of any kind, of dress code, of what you wear, or how you meet or congregate with people, or what movies you see, what music you hear. If you read Death of Democracy, how Greece was overthrown through CIA conduit of funds, and how Greece selected Spiro Agnew as your vice president, and how this group at the Watergate were all closely linked with Spiro Agnew, Charles Colson of the White House, and Mr. Hunt, and Carl McIntyre, and Mr. Sturgis, who was arrested, is closely associated with Mr. Kirk in Florida, and Billy Hargis and the Christian Crusade. you realize that there are levels of freedom and levels of fascism. And the story of the Watergate that's in the news so much, that the Republicans complain about, it's getting so much news coverage, hasn't really started until people ask about the Tackwood allegations, get the document from the Avon Press that's going to print on the Glasshouse tapes, and say who has really been murdering the President of the United States, the candidate for presidency, another candidate for president they're shooting, a man like Ted Kennedy that's thrown off the bridge, the girl was dead in the car went over, he didn't drive it. Who is doing all this, and is this the team that was arrested this time at the Watergate Hotel?
Here I was a huffing airplane glue in a sandwich bag.